There is no denying that psychological and emotional problems, even severe mental distress, can affect most anyone. But does this mean we are all insane? What causes psychological distress? Early psychiatrists thought it was an imbalance of the humors that could only be cured by bleeding patients with knives or leeches. Other psychiatrists believed mental problems came from organs like the tonsils, the stomach, and the spleen, and cut them out. Later were attempts to alter brain function, but these efforts also failed. Today, psychiatrists tell us that the way to fix unwanted behavior is by balancing brain chemistry with a pill. Did they get it right this time?
They say you have a chemical imbalance of serotonin and dopamine, but there's never been a study to ever prove that, ever. It's just been indoctrinated into the culture and television advertising to the point where people now believe it is fact.
Despite this lack of evidence, psychiatrists will tell you that psychotropic drugs are just like mainstream medical drugs. Can this be true? The answer is that unlike a drug such as insulin that corrects a measurable and proven imbalance in the body, psychotropic medications have no visible or measurable physical abnormality to correct. Here is evidence of a bacterial infection. Here is the psychiatric disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Here is a broken arm. Here is major depressive disorder. This is a brain tumor. And this is bipolar disorder. Which raises the question, how can you medicate something that is not physically there? The answer is, you can't. And furthermore, because psychotropic drugs are specifically designed to get past the body's natural defenses and into the brain, they can upset the very delicate processes the brain needs to ensure the body runs smoothly.
Every time you throw something into the system that's foreign to the system, you're creating imbalances elsewhere within the system.
The body changes as a result of taking the medication, so when you stop taking the medication, the body's got to change back to the way it was before, if it can, because it can't always. And in doing so, it disrupts the whole system.
This is what creates the sometimes serious side effects.
Paxil was the drug that gave me insomnia. I would cry very easily on it, and I completely lost my appetite within the first 2 days of taking it.
It didn't help me study, it didn't help me do anything. I didn't even want to do work because I was so sick.
Psych meds didn't help me at all. They made matters, I'd say probably like 10 times worse for me, maybe even 20.
Only now I was further impaired by the medications, and I started having car accidents.
They put me on Zoloft, and it made me want to kill myself.
And I realized that those drugs were just destroying me. Even when I was on them, I realized that they were destroying me.
In spite of the crippling effects of their drugs, psychiatrists and drug companies have used them to create a huge and lucrative market worth billions. And they've done this by naming more and more of life's problems as medical disorders, requiring psychiatric treatment. For example, shyness becomes social anxiety disorder. Loss of a loved one, major depressive disorder. Homesickness, separation anxiety. Suspicion, paranoid personality disorder. Having ups and downs, bipolar disorder. Distractibility, ADHD. This is why it is almost impossible for anyone to see a psychiatrist today and not be diagnosed with a mental illness. And a diagnosis of mental illness means psychotropic drugs.
When a patient goes into a psychiatrist's office and asks for help, probably 98, 99, maybe even 99.9% of people are going to receive a medication.
And these medications have been estimated to cause over 700,000 serious adverse reactions a year and 42,000 deaths. Meanwhile, the psychiatric industry rakes in $1/3 of $1 trillion a year. The issue isn't whether or not people's emotional problems are real. They are. What we really should be asking is, how did psychiatrists convince people that these problems were signs of mental illness? How did they use these illnesses to create a demand by doctors and the public for psychotropic drugs? And how did these drugs, with no known curative powers and a long list of side effects, become the standard treatment for every problem in life? Psychiatrists assert that they have made much progress in the field of mental health over the past century and a half. To prove this, they claim a history of great advancements in the area of psychotropic drugs. But is this parade of brain chemicals the scientific breakthroughs they are leading us to believe? Modern institutional psychiatry has depended on psychotropic drugging since its earliest beginnings in insane asylums during the 19th century. During that period, psychiatrists functioned almost exclusively as attendants, promising to cure the seriously mentally ill. But as they could not, they were not regarded by mainstream medicine as real doctors.
Other physicians considered psychiatrists as almost a doctor. Okay, because they weren't doing medical stuff. So to increase their status, they needed to become much more scientific.
They need to prove that this is a legitimate scientific field. This is a legitimate medical profession. So they start medicalizing everything.
To control behavioral outbursts amongst inmates, psychiatrists employed early psychotropic drugs, such as morphine and opium. But contrary to their claims, these drugs cured nothing and proved to be highly addictive. This led to a whole new generation of dependence, a solution far worse than the original problem. But the attempts to control objectionable behavior continued, and by the turn of the 20th century, phony cures for mental illness, such as heroin, could be found being peddled throughout the United States and Europe. Even psychologist Sigmund Freud played a major role in the creation of the cocaine industry in the Western world, writing many glowing articles promoting its use for spiritual distress and behavioral difficulties.
Freud, as a psychoanalyst, he for a while was promoting cocaine as being a panacea for all kinds of problems.
Freud later wrote,
"The psychic effect of cocaine muriaticum consists of exhilaration and lasting euphoria, produced no compulsive desire to use the stimulant further."
What Freud did not reveal was a significant conflict of interest involving two rival pharmaceutical giants, Merck and Parke-Davis, both paying him to endorse their respective cocaine extracts. Sigmund Freud's early psychotropic drug marketing campaign helped create a major cocaine epidemic throughout Europe at the turn of the century. Clearly, another happy pill would have to be found. It wouldn't take long. Psychiatrists in the first half of the 20th century next turned to amphetamines. As before, the hype subsided into unavoidable proof that the drugs not only were ineffective, but highly toxic and addictive. Each fad followed the same pattern. First, the drug would be hailed as a medical breakthrough for mental problems. Then, increasing reports of serious side effects would trickle in. Finally, after years of denial, when psychiatrists and pharmaceutical companies could no longer deny the dangers of the drug, they would abandon it in favor of their next wonder drug. Though none of their drug therapies had ever proven to cure anything, psychiatrists continued their search for a magic bullet that they supposed would cure all. And in 1954, their dream, they believed, was realized with the introduction of psychiatry's first so-called miracle drug, chlorpromazine, better known as Thorazine. Originally designed and tested as a synthetic dye, then as an anti-parasitic in pigs, Thorazine was accidentally discovered to shut down human motor controls. One of the first papers promoting its psychiatric use stated, "The aim is to produce a state of motor retardation, emotional indifference, and somnolence."
Thorazine was considered the chemical lobotomy. Instead of cutting off the frontal lobes of the brain, with an ice pick. You didn't have to do that kind of surgery. You could do it with a drug.
Thorazine proved so lucrative in immobilizing patients exhibiting unwanted behavior that its maker, SmithKline & French, organized a major promotional campaign around the drug, including paying influential psychiatrists as speakers, organizing media campaigns, and even producing national television shows, a prelude to the mass drug marketing we see all around us today.
Thorazine at that time was thought of as a miracle because it was able to reduce the symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia at that time that they knew about it. It emptied all of the psychiatric housing units.
The campaign was wildly successful. SmithKline & French's income soared by over 500% in the following 2 decades, with Thorazine supplying over a third of the drug company's revenues in 1970. Eventually, an estimated 250 million people worldwide had been on Thorazine and drugs in its class, 23% more than the entire population of the United States. The floodgates had been opened. SKF and the psychiatrists on its payroll had proved that through marketing, there could be big money in psychiatric drugs. But it wasn't long before Thorazine was revealed to have problems of its own.
Thorazine chronically led to really serious problems such as tardive dyskinesia, which is a movement disorder that's very, very bothersome, and supposedly it's irreversible.
The tongue darting, you know, the muscle jerking, you know, the eyes rolling back in the head.
Most people were sometimes permanently damaged by it. So they were going to have to live their life with this neurological problem that was actually created by the pharmaceutical industry with their medication.
Because Thorazine so hindered mental functioning, its use had to be limited to institutions. But with big money at stake, the race was on to discover a psychiatric drug that could be taken out of the institutions and into the hands of a much wider, vaster, and more lucrative market, the general public.
Since they were emptying the institutions of all these psychotic patients with the advent of Thorazine, now they had to find different ways to treat people. So what better way than to go in the community and have an office and bring in your everyday person, or your executive under high stress, or mama who's taking care of all the kids, and they needed some way to create a therapy for them.
In 1955, that drug was approved. Its name was Miltown, the first of the so-called minor tranquilizers. But to sell their new class of psychiatric drugs to the public, psychiatrists and drug companies first had to reposition them as working on a disease process, rather than just as sedating or restraining agents for undesirable human behaviors, as Thorazine had been. To do this, they began a marketing blitz on their colleagues, placing print advertisements in professional publications, such as the American Journal of Psychiatry. Prominent psychiatrists were then hired to spread the word to the rest of the medical field. Few knew that Nathan Kline, one of the most influential psychiatrists of his time, was being paid by the drug industry when he proclaimed that tranquilizers such as Miltown were equal in importance to the introduction of atomic energy, if not more so. Free samples were shipped to psychiatrists and physicians to get patients started on the drug. A year later, the marketing rollout hit the public, and Miltown soon became the first blockbuster psychiatric drug, not just for those incarcerated in an insane asylum, but for the mainstream public. Miltown was marketed to pregnant women, stay-at-home moms, and busy white-collar office workers, who called it executive Excedrin.
So it opened up a door for community-based mental health, whereby the psychiatrist could then have a role. So they became very closely associated with the pharmaceutical industry, and they were demanding as well to come up with better things for mom and pop and the executive and the superstar Hollywood actress or actor, and soon, you know, it became a fashion to take some of these medications.
By the 1960s, 36 million prescriptions for Milltown had been filled in the United States alone, accounting for $200 million in sales, an amount unheard of at that time for any psychiatric drug. Milltown's success led to the introduction of many more psychiatric drugs aimed at the general public throughout the 1950s and 60s. One such drug was Valium. Launched to the delirious acclaim of psychiatrists and the press, Valium was so widely prescribed to stressed-out housewives that it even acquired a nickname, Mother's Little Helper. Lost amidst this hoopla was strong and well-documented early evidence that tranquilizers also came with serious, life-changing side effects. Milltown, for example, was soon labeled by the 1962 President's Advisory Commission on Narcotic and Drug Abuse as more dangerous and addictive even than cocaine or methamphetamine, and fell quickly out of use. But the psychiatric community ignored these warnings. Pandora's box had been opened, and with their new pills, they were no longer caretakers of the insane. They were real doctors administering drugs to patients. And their backward logic was, if the drugs did indeed shut down mental symptoms, weren't they therefore addressing some physical disease in the brain? Within years, this reasoning enabled psychiatry to undergo a profound change. Psychiatrists were no longer caretakers, they were doctors. Mental complaints were no longer psychological, they were symptoms of disease. And to treat them, psychiatrists wrote them prescriptions.
It's all about money. The use of writing prescriptions and having an income from people coming in and getting their prescriptions and this, that, and the other is what revived the psychiatric community. It was the thing that put them back where they were earning money again.
Business was going so well that a group of prominent psychiatrists met in Puerto Rico in 1967 to lay out the expansion of psychotropic drug use for the year 2000. According to organizing psychiatrist Dr. Wayne O. Evans,
psychomedication is now an accepted way of life, and the search for the just right pill has become the goal for many people.
By the early 1980s, Valium had become the most widely prescribed drug of any kind in the Western world. In 1978 alone, nearly 2.3 billion tablets sold, enough to medicate 1/2 of the world population. The business of psychotropic drugging had gotten so out of hand that at a 1979 hearing on the use and abuse of benzodiazepines, one United States senator commented that
the whole pitch appears to be to sell, market, sell, and market.
But bigger things were yet to come.
The next drug that became a rage was Prozac. And of course, Prozac was not for anxiety, but for depression. And all of a sudden, the diagnosis of depression starts multiply. The number of people who are diagnosed as being depressed starts multiplying substantially.
Prozac was released amid great fanfare, with tales of miraculous recoveries, sick minds made well, and ruined lives restored. And all with almost no side effects or addiction, or so its manufacturer claimed. Many new antidepressants quickly followed, also pitching instant psychological relief with little downside. And with this, mainstream psychiatry abandoned psychotherapy for pharmacology forever. In a bold and effective marketing coup, the world was told that these new antidepressant drugs were not just for the depressed, but lifestyle drugs for a choose-your-mood society. But almost immediately, evidence emerged that claims of universal safety and effectiveness were far from the truth.
The adverse side effects of this class of drugs includes things like sexual dysfunction, agitation, facial involuntary movements of the face. Some of the psychiatrists in their books describe the tongue darting in and out of the mouth as an adverse side effect of SSRI drugs.
Within 10 years, staggering details of side effects such as violence and suicide could no longer be ignored, with an estimated 3.9 million adverse events on Prozac alone. Black box warnings alerting the public to significant risks of violence and suicide were issued. once again against loud protests from drug companies and organized psychiatry. But when the patents of antidepressants expired, just as predictably, psychiatrists and drug makers finally admitted the truth. But now they claimed here was a new scientific breakthrough that would change everything. A new class of drugs called the atypical antipsychotic, newly approved to treat both schizophrenia and a then obscure mental disorder dubbed bipolar disorder. Suddenly, the diagnosis of bipolar disorder became the rage, with diagnosis rates soaring by thousands of percentage points in a matter of years.
What is clear is that the patents run out, and the drug companies are always looking to maximize their profits, so they research new drugs, and they can keep them patented for about 17 years and charge monopoly prices. And then when the patent wears off, often the next one comes along.
Soon, however, atypical antipsychotics, like all their predecessors, were revealed as having crippling and even deadly side effects, such as obesity, diabetes, and even heart problems, along with questionable efficacy and almost certain dependency.
Pharmaceutical companies are trying to get away from the old style Thorazines and into the new antipsychotics, and we know that they're no better. So today's new and improved antipsychotic is no better than the old Thorazine, which was the miracle drug for psychiatry.
Today, the same cycle continues, with breathless news coverage of new chemical treatments promoted as breakthroughs. Even hallucinogens such as LSD and ecstasy are now being tested for future psychiatric prescription.
Psychiatry has a wonderful history of coming up with one label after another, all to cover up their own inadequacies and their own inability to get a product, which means to cure somebody or to truly honestly help somebody. So their solution is always, let's come up with another syndrome that person has. It's one alphabet soup label after another.
And just when the public starts catching on to that the experts may be telling us a story, we move on to the next realm of drugs.
Psychiatry has become basically pharmaceutical management in America. That's what psychiatrists do. If you went to a surgeon, you would expect to get cut. If you go to psychiatrists, you expect to get medicated. That's what psychiatrists do.
A century and a half later, two questions remain. Where is the science that backs psychiatry up? And how long will the public continue to be fooled by false hopes, hype, and outright lies? Psychiatrists have long desired to be viewed on a par with medical professionals. But whereas regular physicians have diagnostic tests to prove or disprove illness, psychiatrists do not.
There is no objective testing in psychiatry. There is no blood test, there is no urine test, there is no biopsy. There's nothing that objectively proves that there's anything physiologically or biochemically wrong that's creating your symptoms.
With cancer, you can do a screening and it's there or not. You can look at the cells and you can tell if it's there. Different diseases, you can look at it and you can see it under a microscope, or you can see it in an MRI, or you can see it in a CAT scan. With mental health, you can't see it. You can't be diagnosed in a medical procedure. It's all subjective.
So the question becomes, without any scientific lab tests showing the presence or absence of mental problems, how does psychiatry's diagnostic system work? And how did it become so prevalent? Psychiatry's search for scientific grounding has been going on for well over a century. In the late 19th century, German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin was the first to attempt to classify mental problems as medical disease states. Though he devoted his life attempting to prove that these problems came exclusively from biological and hereditary sources, he never could, finally concluding it was nearly impossible to scientifically distinguish the normal from the insane. In spite of Kraepelin's findings, psychiatrists persisted. with many efforts at classification throughout the years, resulting in the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association in 1952. A small spiral-bound 130-page handbook, DSM-1 described 112 so-called mental disorders, based not on standard scientific procedure, but contributions from a write-in ballot mailed to 10% of the APA's member psychiatrists. With the release of its second edition in 1968, the DSM had now grown to 145 disorders. Still not based on any science, though packed with theories on the origins of its illnesses. But with the sudden surge in popularity of psychiatric drugs such as Miltown and Valium among the general public, the psychiatric community realized that a biological explanation to justify prescribing them had to be found. And they found it in a paper written by psychiatrist Dr. Joseph Schildkraut. Though he had no means of discovering what normal brain chemistry should consist of, Schildkraut theorized that mental problems might be caused by a biochemical imbalance of neurotransmitters in the brain.
It's a great line, the chemical imbalance. There's no evidence for it. There is no way you can measure or document that such a thing occurs in the first place.
There are no lab tests to see what your neurotransmitter levels are or how much you need and how off your balance is.
Chemical imbalance sounds good, sounds scientific, but whereas, as we know, there isn't any way to measure what the balance is.
There is no identifiable chemical imbalance in the human brain other than the chemical imbalance that comes from putting a medication in that brain. And so we've been sold that there's a chemical imbalance, but there's no science to back that up.
Though Schildkraut was never able to prove his chemical imbalance theory, it was too late. The psychiatric community had already adopted the theory as a plausible-sounding medical explanation for the mental disorders listed in the DSM. But without a test confirming a chemical imbalance, psychiatrists were still bedeviled by a severe inconsistency of diagnosis. Not only that, but psychiatrists were often unable to tell the sane from the insane. This point was driven home in 1972 in the famous Rosenhan experiment, where a total of 8 perfectly healthy volunteers each presented themselves at a mental institution, claiming to hear voices in their head that only said the words empty, hollow, or thud. No other psychiatric symptoms were stated. The result, each of the volunteers, including Dr. David Rosenhan himself, was immediately committed into the institution.
The moment we were admitted to the hospital, we abandoned our symptom, and we behaved the way we usually behave. The question was, would anyone detect that we were sane? The answer was, no. No one ever did.
All but one was diagnosed as schizophrenic. They were only discharged after admitting they were indeed mentally ill and in remission. After learning of the experiment, the psychiatric community was furious. One hospital challenged Rosenhan to send in more volunteers, promising to catch every one of the fake patients. 3 months later, they proudly announced that of 193 patients presenting themselves, they had turned away over 41 who were pretending mental illness and considered another 42 suspect. The problem was, Dr. Rosenhan hadn't sent in a single person. 70 years later, Emil Kreplin's conclusion that psychiatry could not distinguish sanity from insanity had once again been proven correct. In his study, Rosenhan concluded, any diagnostic process that lends itself too readily to massive errors of this sort cannot be a very reliable one. It wasn't just the embarrassment of the Rosenhan experiment that caused psychiatry's leadership to take a new approach to diagnosis. With the rapid expansion in the psychotropic drug business, psychiatry underwent a seismic shift in the way it promoted mental illness. And the third edition of the DSM, spearheaded by psychiatrist Dr. Robert Spitzer, took a decidedly brain-based biological approach. Unlike its predecessors, the proposed DSM-3 assumed that mental problems derived from physical abnormalities of the brain. And instead of describing possible psychological causes for mental distress, DSM-3 would simply provide clinicians with checklists of symptoms. However, these descriptions were broad enough to apply to anyone at any time of life. With no science to back them up, these newly proposed disorders and the checklists that went with them were subject to intense negotiation, compromise, alteration, and heated debate. Psychiatrist David Schaffer, who attended the DSM-3 conference, observed,
people would shout out their opinions from all sides of the room, and whoever shouted loudest tended to be heard. My own impression, is coming straight from England, was it was more like a tobacco auction than a sort of conference.
Many committees are established to determine what should and shouldn't go into the DSM, the current revision. And a lot of the committee activity is based upon, could be personal bias, political pressure, the trend that may be in vogue then, and other things that are non-medical.
Well, in the DSM, I mean, they vote in diseases. I mean, they get together, the panel, psychiatrists look and decide, is this a disease or is this not a disease?
How many of you agree this should be a disease? They have a show of hands. They said 20 people in the room, 12 vote for it, 8 vote against it. Bingo. They have a disease. Tell me that that's science.
One psychologist reported that during discussions of the proposed criteria for masochistic personality disorder, Spitzer's wife protested about one symptom of the disorder, to which Spitzer responded, "Okay, take it out." Scientific or not, once a disorder is voted into the DSM, it is very hard to vote it out. On rare occasions, however, this too has occurred. Homosexuality, a mental illness according to DSM 1 and 2. After gay rights activists picketed their 1973 convention, the American Psychiatric Association buckled to political pressure and decided by a mail-in ballot of its member psychiatrists to remove it from DSM's next edition.
What happened? It wasn't like, there's some objective evidence that at one point it was a disease and we cured the disease and that's a lifestyle choice. No, it was cultural. We became more liberal in this country and decided, okay, it's fine. Whereas, 50, 100 years ago, it wasn't fine, it was a problem. That's not medicine, that's something else.
And the psychiatrists who wrote the DSM-3 knew it, as Robert Spitzer would admit to the BBC many years later.
What happened is that we made estimates of prevalence of mental disorders totally descriptively, without considering that many of these conditions might be normal reactions, which are not really disorders. That's the problem.
But instead of learning from their mistakes, the American Psychiatric Association published the DSM-4 in 1994. And it was even bigger, with 374 different diagnoses amongst its 886 pages. The new edition more than tripled the number of mental illnesses listed in the DSM-1. This rapid expansion in the number of psychiatric diagnoses may not help the patient, but it benefits many others. Once a diagnosis has been created, it enters the professional curricula. Specialists emerge to treat it. Conferences are organized around it. Research and publications cover it. Psychiatrists formulate their patients' symptoms to correspond to it, and drugs are prescribed for it. The DSM, in short, was no longer a manual, but a full-fledged industry.
The DSM, although it is our Bible, it becomes the Bible and it becomes tantamount to, the tablet coming down from Mount Sinai, not just for psychiatry and psychology, but for insurance companies, for the legal profession. It comes into play as far as sentencing. It comes into play as far as custody decisions. So non-scientific information is used to make some radical, life-altering or life-ending decisions.
The danger of all these psychiatric diseases is that anyone walking the earth today could be labeled as having a mental illness. Using the DSM, psychiatrists at Harvard University have declared that half of everyone on earth will be mentally ill in their lifetime. One prominent Harvard psychiatrist, Dr. John Rady, goes a step further, arguing no one is truly normal. Though the American Psychiatric Association has quietly acknowledged the lack of evidence for Joseph Schildkraut's chemical imbalance theory, the claim is still flogged in the media and passed on to patients every day. And although you are not likely to hear it in the general media, psychiatrists readily admit that the disorders listed in the DSM have no proven pathology and therefore cannot be called medical diseases.
If you were to be confronted with someone saying that the DSM is not backed up by science, what do you have to say about that?
Oh, I would say that they're entirely right.
No, the DSM is not science.
I think there are non-scientific elements, political aspects of it that influence it. Yeah, absolutely.
DSM-4 is still far away from science.
DSM system is far from perfect, but it's the best we have.
DSM stands for diagnosis as a source of money. It brings in a lot of money.
Nonetheless, the next edition, DSM-5, is in the planning stages and is due to be published in 2012. And this time, the negotiation for the next new psychiatric diseases is being held in secret. But we do know some of the new disorders under consideration. One is Internet Addiction Disorder, originally presented as a joke in a 1997 New Yorker article. Regardless, it is now claimed that 25 million people may qualify as compulsive surfers. Other disorders contemplated for DSM-5 include compulsive shopping disorder, binge eating, apathy disorder, parental alienation syndrome, relational disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, road rage. All potential disease categories with psychotropic drugs waiting to be assigned to them. According to the APA, 19 of the 27 psychiatrists on the top panel deciding on what illnesses to include in the next edition of the DSM have financial ties to drug companies. The situation got so bad that the architect of DSM-3, Robert Spitzer, and DSM-4 editor Alan Francis went public, warning the APA might well be accused of a conflict of interest in fashioning DSM-5 to create new patients for psychiatrists and new customers for pharmaceutical companies. But the psychiatric community has decided not to address this issue, and for good reason. Today, psychiatric drugging rakes in over $80 billion a year for pharmaceutical companies. And with every new edition of the DSM, the diagnoses have not only expanded in number, but cast a wider net to encompass such population segments as senior citizens, the military, pregnant women, and even children.
In my training, when I first started this, they told us that they would not give a bipolar diagnosis for a child under 18. These days, I see children diagnosed with bipolar disorder at 5 and 6 years old.
A 2-year-old can be throwing a temper tantrum and then stop and be fine. Anybody that's a parent has seen that happen. That doesn't mean they're mentally ill. It means they're 2-year-olds.
How can you even diagnose a 2-year-old as a bipolar disorder? I mean, how can you diagnose anybody as a bipolar disorder if you want to look at it that way? Because there is no such thing as bipolar disorder, not from a medical standpoint. It's not like you can find a cell in a person that shows that they have bipolar disorder. It's not like they have a fever or run a temperature, like if they had a physical illness. This is a behavioral definition only. In other words, a human being sat there and made a subjective decision that this person has this so-called condition.
Today, nearly 1 million children are diagnosed as bipolar, making it more common than autism and diabetes combined. In 2007, 500,000 children and teenagers took at least one prescription for an antipsychotic, including 20,000 under the age of 6. Antipsychotic drugs, powerful chemicals designed originally for only the most seriously mentally troubled, are now a $22.8 billion industry.
If you spent days reading the newest DSM, you would be able to diagnose every human being that you ever saw. And with the diagnosis comes treatment.
The DSM most definitely helps in the prescribing of drugs. It legitimizes the process of pulling out the prescription pad. Because here is this disease entity. The disease entity is addressed with this medication.
And the DSM is in the service of making things reductionist into very simple, simplistic ways of looking at things. That makes it easier for the pharmaceutical company to create a medication for. The only thing that we've left out of that equation is the person.
And the average person is completely unaware that psychiatric diagnoses are not medical, but merely voted on behaviors. Which leads us to our next question. How do psychiatrists take these invented disorders and get people to believe they have them? According to psychiatrists at the World Health Organization, 450 million people worldwide have a mental disorder. 3 times the metropolitan populations of Tokyo, New York, Los Angeles, London, Paris, Mexico City, Mumbai, Milano, Madrid, Toronto, Washington, Athens, Melbourne, Hong Kong, Singapore, Rome, and Berlin combined. Are there really this many mentally ill? Or is this just a case of good marketing? In early 1999, the United States was confronted with news of a frightening new disease epidemic. You blush, sweat, shake, even find it hard to breathe, posters read, with the tagline, "Imagine being allergic to people." The disease was social anxiety disorder, SAD, or SAD, and it was claimed to affect about 13.3% of the American population. And to find out more, readers were instructed to contact a group called the Social Anxiety Disorder Coalition. What the public was not told was that both the coalition and the campaign were created by a public relations agency and bankrolled by a drug company. Later that year, while the campaign was making millions of people aware of this previously unknown disease, the antidepressant Paxil became the first drug approved by the FDA for the treatment of social anxiety disorder. Psychiatrists such as Jack Gorman of Columbia University and Murray Stein of the University of California at San Diego signed up as psychiatric frontmen for Paxil's ad campaign. And within 3 years, Paxil shot from 3rd place in its drug class to 1st. Paxil's product director would later boast, "Every marketer's dream is to find an unidentified or unknown market and develop it." That's what we were able to do with social anxiety disorder. Paxil's competition took notice. That same year, Pfizer got FDA approval to sell its antidepressant, Zoloft, for treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. They too hired a public relations firm to create their own psychiatric front group and paid psychiatrists to spread the word about the disorder. This campaign would claim that 1 person in 13 would develop PTSD over the course of a lifetime. And this included anyone witnessing a violent act, natural disaster, or distressing event. And as with Paxil, sales of Zoloft skyrocketed.
For the psychiatric drugs, the goal is to have as many people on them as possible. So the way to do that is to convince normal people that they have some defect or mental disease or condition that requires treatment. So I mean that's the way they do it. They hire these big marketing companies that come up with these campaigns.
We're going to tell you about your disease so that you can lead a happier, healthier life. Oh, and by the way, we have a drug too that helps to treat this disease.
This practice of selling sickness is known as disease mongering, a term defined by the late journalist Lynn Payer as trying to convince essentially well people that they are sick, or slightly sick people that they are very ill. On Madison Avenue, disease mongering is accomplished through a strategy known as condition branding, where mental illness is pitched just like cars, beer, or laundry detergent. And according to top New York branding guru Vince Parry, no therapeutic category is more accepting of condition branding than the field of anxiety and depression, where illness is rarely based on measurable physical symptoms and therefore open to conceptual definition. Parry then suggests to executives 3 principal strategies for what he called fostering the creation of psychiatric illness. The first is elevating the importance of a condition, or leading the public to believe that a minor or temporary mental problem is much worse and far more widespread than it really is. Prior to the introduction of SSRI antidepressants, depression was considered, even by psychiatrists, to affect only 100 people per million. Since then, estimates have been raised to as many as 100,000 cases per million, a 1,000-fold increase. The result is about 10% of Americans, some 27 million people, currently on antidepressants, twice as many as in 1996.
Very good marketing, that all, expressions of human emotion, deep sadness and fear and anger and whatever else they happen to be, are now classified as, a major problem, a psychiatric problem, a psychological problem that needs to be dealt with drugs.
Another psychiatric illness, bipolar disorder, was also considered rare, affecting only 1/10% when it was first introduced in the DSM-3. Today, there are claims that as many as 10% of the population, 100 times the original number, have the condition. Pediatric bipolar disorder was not even listed in the DSM when Harvard psychiatrist Dr. Joseph Biederman began publishing studies claiming that mood swings in children were not normal behaviors, but in reality, mental illnesses. Biederman's disease-mongering campaign worked. In the last decade alone, the rate of children labeled with bipolar has soared 4,000%. But what parents were not told was that 25 different drug companies had underwritten Dr. Biederman's work. The extent of their influence was not revealed until a 2008 Senate investigation exposed Dr. Biederman for failing to report more than $1.6 million in pharmaceutical income. But these revelations had no effect on psychiatry. Pediatric bipolar continues to be widely accepted in the psychiatric community.
These labels are being applied to younger and younger children, which I think is really, a sad case. I'm sure I agree with any of those labels to begin with, but let alone for them to be applied universally to young kids.
This idea that childhood itself is a psychiatric disease is simply based off some completely unsubstantiated idea that got printed in the psychiatric manual, and there's no science behind it whatsoever.
Disease-mongering strategy number 2, redefining an existing condition. This tactic takes an ordinary state of mind and recasts it as a psychiatric disease that now must be treated with drugs. Case in point, the winter blues, a common mental condition related to the lack of sunlight during winter months, but redefined by psychiatrists as seasonal affective disorder, a psychiatric disease requiring psychiatric treatment. As another example, consider the changing emotions during a woman's menstruation, made over by psychiatrists as premenstrual dysphoric disorder, a mental illness discovered not in a laboratory, but in the marketing department of drug maker Eli Lilly.
When Prozac patent came up, they realized they needed to come up with some sort of new to keep the money rolling in, and they came up with a new disorder. They just made it out of thin air. The premenstrual dysphoric disorder, the PMDD, and then the new wonder drug, which was Serafem, which if you look at Serafem on the back of the label, it just says, this is Prozac. And they were able to keep that patent so that nobody else could make it, so that they could keep that money rolling in.
Many of the drugs today are simply drugs repackaged. They're drugs that had a patent and now are generic, or now get called something else, or they decide now to use them for something else.
Disease-mongering strategy number 3, creating a new condition for an unmet market need. Example, compulsive shopping disorder, publicized by psychiatrist Dr. Jack Gorman. In Gorman's public appearances, a recent study was cited that claimed that as many as 20 million Americans, 90% of them women, could have the problem. What he did not reveal was that the study was funded by Forest Laboratories, maker of the antidepressant Celexa, and that he was a paid consultant to at least 13 pharmaceutical firms, Forest included. Most consumers have never heard of the concept of marketing of disease for profit, but to those in the advertising and drug industries, it is well known. A 2005 Reuters Business Insight report, written for drug company executives, notes that the ability to create new disease markets is bringing untold billions in soaring drug sales, and that the coming years will bear greater witness to the corporate-sponsored creation of disease.
If I can't get along with my husband, take a drug. If I'm feeling a little depressed, take a drug. If I can't study properly, take a drug. We've become a fast food, what I call a fast food, fast drug society.
One might then ask, is anyone questioning this rampant increase in extremely questionable and scientifically unproven mental diagnoses? In April 2006, the British Medical Journal inadvertently found out when they published a groundbreaking study announcing a newly discovered psychiatric disease, motivational deficiency disorder, or MODED. Characterized by lethargy and an unwillingness to work, MODED was claimed to affect millions. But when media outlets around the world uncritically broadcast the news, the journal told the truth. The study was part of their April Fool's Day edition. But the joke made its point. Disease mongering works. Even people without any mental illness at all can be deemed at risk and recommended drug treatment. One study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association urged all stroke victims to take an antidepressant to prevent depression, whether they were depressed or not. It was later discovered that its authors had an undisclosed financial relationship with the maker of the antidepressant Lexapro. Preventive drugging is the wave of the future. As one expert noted, there is an apparently limitless amount of money to be made from marketing pharmaceutical remedies for diseases, and even more from remedies to reduce risk factors for disease.
And of course, every time they come out with a new mental disorder, then they come out with a new drug to counteract it. At least to me, it seems like nothing more than a marketing ploy.
There are certain executives in the pharmaceutical manufacturers that have stated that one day in America, every person will be on drugs, healthy or not.
With these clever disease-mongering campaigns, 100 million people worldwide are currently on psychotropic drugs. And as a result, the psychotropic drug industry is grossing over $150,000 every minute. Observed one consumer advocate, you can sell hundreds of millions of dollars worth of a drug, even a bad drug, if you have the right marketing campaign. Which leads us to our next question. Now that disease-mongering campaigns are creating the illusion of widespread mental illness, how safe are the drugs psychiatrists are prescribing to treat it? In modern psychiatry, psychotropic drugs have become the weapons of choice. But are they as safe as we've been led to believe? International regulatory bodies, such as the United States Food and Drug Administration, require that all drugs be proven safe and effective before they can be released. To accomplish this, pharmaceutical companies must conduct thorough and exacting clinical trials that prove the safety and efficacy of their drugs prior to marketing. At least, that's what's supposed to happen. But underneath the public relations veneer, claims of psychotropic drug safety by psychiatrists and drug companies are far from the truth. And there are many reasons why. To begin with, drug safety testing is predominantly done by drug companies, not by governmental agencies or independent laboratories, creating an obvious conflict of interest.
They pay for it, they bring in the researchers, they have every opportunity to skew the research, to manipulate it, to produce exactly what they want it to produce.
The first step in submitting an application for a psychotropic drug is to find a disorder in psychiatry's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and attach it to the drug. Then clinical trials begin, first on animals, then on humans. If the drug makes it to human testing, clinical trials then follow 4 phases. In phase 1, it is tested on a very small number of volunteers, usually healthy young subjects, to determine if the drug is not overly toxic and what side effects it carries.
And the studies that are done have young men or women that have very little body fat and are healthy in their 20s. They don't test these drugs on elderly people that have a huge amount of body fat or a different proportion of body fat, and they hold the reaction of their drugs is totally different, but they don't ever consider that.
In phase 2, psychiatric researchers determine if the drug creates the sought-after effects on the human body, and how large a dose can be given before drug toxicity sets in. As in phase 1, test subjects are mostly healthy young volunteers.
So just the people that I already know are going to perform well on my drug are going to be entered in this trial. Well, how well do you think your drug's going to come out?
Phase 3 testing compares the psychotropic drug against a placebo or sugar pill. Although phase 3 testing is larger and more extensive than phases 1 or 2, it normally involves only about 1,000 patients and lasts a mere 4 to 8 weeks, certainly not enough time to determine any long-term side effects. Today, clinical research is a profit-driven multinational industry where drug companies and psychiatric researchers are involved in every detail, from study design to data analysis to study publication. But in doing their trials, psychiatrists face a problem the rest of the medical field does not. They have no scientific lab tests to objectively measure improvement.
On a clinical trial for, say, a drug for cancer or for high cholesterol, it's easy to see if something is working because you can look at the study result. The cholesterol level is dropped, or the cancer is shrunk, or the cancer cells are going away, or there are less of them. You can physically see the answer. With mental health issues, you don't have that luxury.
It is this lack of science that permits psychiatric drug researchers many opportunities to skew results of drug trials in the pharmaceutical company's favor.
One of the ones I think that is most important is the placebo washout. And what that is basically that they give people placebo pill, the sugar pill, and then anybody who says that they feel better, they get rid of them. And so in which case, they already skew the sample of people being included into the study. That's going to stack the cards against the placebo, and it's going to show an artificial greater effect for the drug.
The data shows that the people that got placebo did better. And you know what the researchers said? Oh, that's the placebo effect. Well, we want to get those people out of the study.
Another trick of the trade involves giving subjects the test drugs prior to the trial and then putting them in withdrawal. Then, after starting the trial, they are put back on the test drug and will either come out of withdrawal and score better, or, if on a placebo, will continue to feel worse. Psychiatrist Richard Barrison, for example, took schizophrenics off Haldol to generate active psychosis, then put them back on Haldol during the trial. In spite of this, his study is still cited in psychiatric literature.
Another way that they can manipulate the data is unweighted distributions. I have 3 studies that I look at. One study has 1,000 people in it, and another one has 10 people in it, and another one has 15 people in it. The 1,000-person study showed that the drug was no benefit at all. But the 2 other studies that only had 10 and 15 people in it showed the drugs were incredibly superior. So what do they say? They say 2 out of 3 studies showed greater benefit to the drug group.
Perhaps the most common way of tilting the outcome of a clinical trial is simply not to count the individuals dropping out of the study because of the side effects. In fact, in clinical trials for the antipsychotic Zyprexa, 2/3 of the 2,500 participants had so many side effects they dropped out. Of the remaining 800, 22% reported serious adverse reactions to the drug. And during the Prozac approval trials, of the 11,000 patients tested, only 286, less than 3%, actually completed the short 4 to 6 week trials. In another common practice, adverse side effects are covered up by giving additional drugs that are not part of the study. And some researchers have been known to simply falsify the studies. Case in point, psychiatrist Farouk Abuzahab, former ethics committee chair of the Minnesota Psychiatry Society, whose patient he recruited into one of his clinical trials, reported having extreme thoughts of suicide. In his research documents, however, he noted 0 adverse events. 2 days later, she jumped from a Minneapolis bridge to her death. A final way of skewing test data is to hide unwanted drug reactions under less frightening terms. This trick was used in the notorious Paxil Study 329, where such side effects as aggressive events, homicidal thoughts, and homicidal acts were categorized under the word hostility, while under the nebulous term emotional lability were filed suicidal thoughts and actions. In many cases, clinical trials are set up not to look for violence and suicide at all.
It is a problem that if these clinical trials don't specifically really ask a lot of questions about the nature of suicidal ideation and how the person feels and hopelessness and akathisia, if they don't ask those questions very specifically, they're not going to really get that data, and it's not going to come up.
Designing biased trials to avoid negative findings, interpreting the raw data to favor your drug, and spinning the entire study to accentuate the positive are just some of the many, many ways to bias a trial. It is this perfect storm of intellectual dishonesty that has led one drug expert to conclude that it can be proven that most claimed research findings are false. But it is the drug companies that own the studies, and when they believe they have compiled enough evidence to convince regulators that their drug is safe and effective, they submit their phase 3 clinical trials for approval. The FDA only requires that 2 clinical trials be submitted, so drug companies can conduct as many studies as it takes to find the 2 that have the best chance at FDA approval.
You only need 2 positive trials against placebo, and it doesn't matter if you did 1,000, as long as you get 2. And it's amazing, sometimes they actually don't. They might pool data from another couple of clinical trials in order to get that approved.
They don't need to report all their data. They don't need to report all the trials that they do. They only need to report the ones that they want. They can handpick whichever one they want and then submit just those couple to the FDA.
As FDA Director of the Division of Neuropharmacological Drug Products, psychiatrist Paul Lieber complained, the sponsor could just do studies until the cows come home, until he gets 2 of them that are statistically significant by chance alone, walks them out, and says he had met the criteria.
The New England Journal published a study about a year ago showing that many clinical trials that had been conducted and registered with the Food and Drug Administration were never published because they came out showing no significant advantage over placebo. So antidepressants are not as effective as they are being made out to be, and the side effects are not as emphasized as much as they should be.
This point was driven home in 2008 by psychologist Irving Kirsch and his colleagues, who obtained every clinical trial ever submitted, published and unpublished, from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration of 4 new-generation antidepressants. The results were both alarming and enlightening. In Kirsch's words, antidepressant medications have reported only modest benefits over placebo treatment, and when unpublished trial data are included, the benefit falls below accepted criteria for clinical significance. In addition to this, volumes of effects associated with these antidepressants have since been discovered, including homicide, suicide, and mass murder.
People really don't realize that from the beginning there's been a question of how marginally efficacious these drugs really are apart from placebo.
And yet we have horrific side effects. Combine the 2, and where's your risk to benefit ratio? It's down the toilet.
But psychiatrists dismissed Kirsch's study because psychotropic drugs are big business, and clinical trials are a big part of that business. Take, for example, Martin Keller, former chair of the psychiatry department at Brown University, lead author of the so-called Paxil 329 study. This clinical trial, which tested hundreds of children on the antidepressant Paxil, found that the drug was generally well tolerated and effective, which in scientific terms is glowing praise. And the study's list of co-authors, 22 of the most prominent key opinion leaders in psychiatry.
I mean, that was a lot of people, but they were the who's who of psychiatry, and this was going to be a publication that I think, took them, into the end zone on getting their approval for kids.
With the FDA's blessing, Paxil became a blockbuster in the child and adolescent market, with sales of $55 million in 2002. It wasn't until the New York State Attorney General's office sued in 2004 that the truth finally came out. The raw data showed that not only was Paxil no more effective than placebo, but the young patients on Paxil were 6 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts. In fact, this data also revealed that 11 of the 93 children on the study developed serious side effects, of whom 7 had to be hospitalized. But according to Keller's own administrator, many of those children were either dropped from the study or coded as non-compliant to avoid having to be counted. While admitting no guilt, the drug company settled out of court for $2.5 million, less money than Paxil was grossing every 7 hours. Hundreds of civil suits followed, but when Dr. Keller, as lead author of the Paxil 329 study, was deposed by attorneys, he would not admit to much.
I can't remember exactly what I said. I don't remember anything specific about any of these meetings. If my name wasn't on the top, I wouldn't remember ever having seen it. If I saw them, I don't remember. The answer is, I don't remember. I don't recall if I was. I don't recall asking him, which isn't to say that I didn't.
I want to pick up on the question Mr. Coffin asked you about the 5-fold increase of the Paxil kids experiencing suicidality over the placebo kids. Do you recall those questions?
I do.
And you said that you weren't particularly aware of that, except for with regard to a manuscript that was sent to you in confidence by GSK.
Correct.
That actually is not correct, though. I mean, this was an issue that had been presented to you by a number of different reporters that you personally responded to. Is that correct?
I don't remember.
How could Dr. Keller have known so little about the drug study of which he was lead author, and which he himself used to promote Paxil for children in prominent medical journals and conferences?
The ultimate publication of Study 329 was ghostwritten by an agency hired by GlaxoSmithKline, and eventually they, after the manuscript was written, they put Martin Keller's name on it as an author.
There again, and maybe you can tell me where I can find it in the paper.
No, I'm asking you if you were aware.
I don't remember the specifics.
And then we finally showed him a document from GlaxoSmithKline where GlaxoSmithKline says that the study was entirely flawed. It was a complete failed study, and it certainly didn't show that Paxil was remarkably efficacious for treating children and adolescents in depression.
Can you read that into the record, please?
Essentially, the study did not really show Paxil was effective in treating adolescent depression, which is not something we want to publicize.
We asked him, with that information now, how can you tell us that it would be okay and safe to give a kid Paxil? And he couldn't answer the question. He sat back, he put his head in his hands, and for, the longest 2 minutes sat there silent.
During the last 2 years of his Paxil study, Keller personally pocketed $1 million in drug company money, none of which he disclosed in his published research.
When people look at the field of psychiatry and they hear all these reports in the New York Times and Boston Globe, and they see this psychiatrist or this psychologist, took money and didn't disclose it, they wonder, well, is this causing up biases, in the field? I think that's a legitimate concern of the public because of the fact that it is true.
With this level of corruption pervading the testing of psychotropic drugs, one is left with the question, where are those who are entrusted with our protection? Government regulators are supposed to watch out for patients' welfare. So why are so many dangerous psychotropic drugs being allowed on the market? At one point, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration was considered the gold standard in drug safety. But this is no longer the case with psychotropic drugs, where psychiatrists and drug companies have virtually taken over the approval process. FDA drug advisory panels that recommend the approval of psychotropic drugs have long been filled with psychiatrists with financial ties to drug companies. One study showed that 92% of FDA advisory meetings in the last decade included at least one member with conflicts of interest. In response to the accusation of conflict of interest, the FDA says that they have tried to find mental health experts without drug industry connections, but can't locate any. To solve this, they issue waivers, where a psychiatrist is allowed to sit on a psychotropic drug advisory panel, despite having a financial conflict of interest of up to $50,000 a year with drug companies.
The advisory panels that review drugs, most of these people are direct recipients of money from usually the drug under study, the company that's submitting the drug, and they waive the conflicts most of the time. So it's pretty pervasive, and it's quite insidious.
Full waivers have been granted to the following participants. Dr. Andrew Leon for his role as a member of a data safety monitoring board for an affected firm. He receives between $10,001 and $50,000 per year. Dr. Bruce Pollock has been granted a limited waiver for his activities on an advisory board and speakers bureau for an affected firm in which he receives less than $10,001 per year. Ms. Jean Bronstein for her ownership of stock and a bond in an affected firm in which the value falls between $50,001 and $100,000.
You could be paid massive amounts of money by the drug companies, you know, in this sense, and then turn your head here and say, okay, now I'm going to review the drug. And that huge conflict of interest was not to be discussed. In fact, they didn't want people putting it out there. That was the policy. So they still allow it. They still allow that conflict to continue. But now it's meant to, you know, I guess they're supposed to acknowledge if there's a conflict of interest. But acknowledging the conflict and getting rid of the conflict are two different things.
The revolving door between government, academia, and the drug industry is one of psychiatry's worst-kept secrets.
There's a revolving door, FDA and drug, FDA and drug. So we have a system where those institutions that people trust, want to trust, would like to trust, are truly untrustworthy.
Case in point, Daniel Troy, a former drug company lobbyist who was then hired as general counsel for the FDA, where he filed legal briefs in favor of drug companies and against drug victims.
He was the drug lobbyist lawyer, and then he became the general counsel of the FDA. I mean, they talk about having the wolf watch the chickens.
After leaving the FDA, Daniel Troy went back to the drug industry, where he is now Senior Vice President and General Counsel for pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline. This is the atmosphere under which psychiatrists at the FDA give drug makers approval to sell psychotropic drugs. But the clinical trials are not supposed to end here. There is one final stage of testing to go, Phase 4. Phase 4 requires that drug companies track the adverse side effects that will undoubtedly occur in the general public, well beyond the very small samples of Phase 3. The sheer number of side effects that will now emerge has prompted one advocacy group to warn that most drug safety problems will not show up until the drug has been on the market for at least 7 years.
The meds are not tested long-term before they get approval from the FDA. The studies tend to be a matter of weeks or a few months, but nothing looking at over the years. And the data that's coming in now from Europe and also in the United States is that the side effects are deadly.
Instead of serving a safety function as post-marketing surveillance, Phase 4 clinical trials are now being recast as post-marketing research and repurposed into a means of testing psychotropic drugs for additional psychiatric disorders. Take Zoloft, FDA approved in 1991 to treat major depression. Since then, it has also been okayed to treat obsessive-compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, panic disorder, and social anxiety disorder. In 2005, the last full year before it lost its patent, Zoloft grossed $3.3 billion. And as with other psychotropic drugs, much of that is pure profit. 100 Xanax pills, for example, only cost 2.5 cents to manufacture, but retail on average for $136.79, a profit of well over 500,000%. It is for this reason that drug companies enjoy profit margins of about 16%, triple the norm of most businesses. In 2006, drug company CEOs of the 10 leading drug companies were paid an average of $18 million a year, almost 400 times the median household income of the average American family. Investors also love pharmaceutical companies producing psychotropic drugs, since psychiatrists never prescribe them to cure mental problems, but to manage them, often for a lifetime. And lifetime customers have a huge impact on the bottom line. As one stock analyst famously commented, the first disaster is if you kill people. The second disaster is if you cure them. Pharmaceutical company stock has been one of Wall Street's most consistent winners and is widely considered one of the most profitable investments one could make. In 2002, the total profits of the top 10 drug companies in the Fortune 500 exceeded the combined profits of the other 490 businesses. And a downturn in pharmaceutical stock prices would constitute major losses for investors throughout the world, and investments must be protected. With so much money at stake, is it any wonder that stockholders are never told the truth about the drugs they are investing in? They are unaware that FDA approval does not guarantee drug safety, and that the clinical trials justifying that approval are frequently based on falsities and deceptions. But once the drug is approved, the next challenge is, how do you convince prescribing physicians that these drugs are truly safe, effective, and carrying few side effects when the drug company's own trials prove that this is not the case?